So in government we have KTJ B, in opposition we had Alor Akar A. Alright, my name is Amira, I'll be your chair for today. I'll also be the time. You guys are okay, right, with this being aired?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So without further ado, I make a motion that this House would remove all laws prohibiting self-harm. I invite the Prime Minister.
The function of government is to best inform their citizens. In that circumstance, if I choose to undertake an action that brings harm to nobody but myself, no one on earth has a right to tell me that I can't do it, especially the law. So let's first of all take a look at our policy. Firstly, we will remove any and all laws that criminalize activities that only bring self-harm. What are some examples that we're talking about? First of all, laws against suicide. Secondly, laws that criminalize drug use. Thirdly, laws that are against self-mutilation for religious reasons. It has to be clear that this self-harm must be only undertaken as a result of your own volition. For example, female genital mutilation cannot be done on your daughter. If you wish to undertake it yourself, then it is fine. You can't force drugs upon another person. However, if you wish to consume these drugs and purchase these drugs for yourself, that is fine. Thirdly, just to get this out of the way, clearly it does not apply to children. The age of majority and the age of consent is already in application, and we feel that this still stands. Fourthly, it has to be very clear that this action can only bring harm to yourself. Let's look at a parallel that currently exists in society. If I wish to consume alcohol, I may do so. I may drink as much as I like. However, the minute I start driving under influence, the minute that my actions have the ability to harm other people, that is when governments start clamping down. That is a parallel that currently exists in society, and that is a parallel that we wish to draw today. I have two substantives for you today. First of all, to what extent can the state control your life? And secondly, why the law is the worst way to discourage self-harm. Let us first of all look at the duty of a state. The state's duty is to facilitate your conception of a good life and to ensure that that conception that you have does not infringe upon other people's ability to carry out their own notion of a good life. What does this mean? This means that you should be able to do what you like so long as it does not harm other people. If you wish to take drugs, that is fine. If you wish to consume alcohol, that is fine. However, the minute you start doing actions that can potentially harm other people, such as driving under influence, that is when states start clamping down. No, thank you. Given that the fact that a state provides you the complete understanding of the actions and the effects of your actions, for example, you know that maybe taking drugs could potentially harm certain of your organs. The minute that you know all the different things that encompass your actions, the effects that will result of your actions, states no longer are in a position to dictate your life. There are a number of reasons for this. First of all, the state can never understand what an action means to yourself. No, thank you. The state is not a body that is able to comprehend what those actions mean to yourself. Let us take a look at this in context. Let's take a look at suicide. To the state, you wanting to commit suicide and makes you another individual who's doing something that is purposeless. That is in the view of the state. But let us look at it in the view of an individual. If you are a person who, after having thought about it for months, after you had culminated all your thoughts and decided that to you, that was the meaningful way for you to end your life, That is what you as a person wanted to do. That is what you felt was the thing that you needed to do. That is what is your conception of a good life. A state can never understand this because the state is not in a position to understand what an action means to that particular person. Second, let us look at what punishing self-harm does. Punishing self-harm causes the state to reduce an individual to another meaningless self. It makes you another homogeneous unit of society because they no longer take into account your personal preferences. They no longer take into account what the things you do mean to you as an individual. If the state has the right to decide your consumption of drugs, whether you mutilate yourself for religious reasons, then arguably a state has the right to decide your life on a whole paradigm of other things. Let us look at mountain climb. Objectively, when we look statistically, mountain climbing causes more deaths than drug use. It is something that is dangerous and brings little benefit except the happiness that you accrue to yourself. Secondly, let us look at pregnancy in rural areas. Pregnancy in rural areas is dangerous. Look at it. It's an overburdened population, first of all. And secondly, they don't have the medical capabilities. Yes?
So am I correct if I say that you, your side, will start prohibiting these acts if they actually bring third-party harm, no matter is it big or small?
Look, the very simple fact is these actions do not bring third-party harms. If I wish to carry out female genital mutilation on myself, as we said, this self-harm has to be of your own decision. It has to be your own volition. That is something which side opposition clearly has to understand. Let's look at fast food. Fast food arguably makes you obese. It arguably causes you cardiovascular disease. But it is something that you are allowed to do. Secondly, we understand that sometimes side opposition may feel self-harm is undesirable, that they may not want suicide. However, we on side government clearly feel that we are fine with self-harm. Let us look at why side opposition is so obsessed with the law carrying out, why this is bad and why this doesn't work. There are 4 reasons for this. First of all, let us look at what happens when you punish individuals for self-harm. Number 1, you do not give them an incentive to seek out help. The individual will feel that, okay, I'm harming myself, I'm doing things, but I'm not going to go out there and reach out for help. Why? Because you're going to punish me the minute I reach out. This can be clearly put into context. Let's look at, secondly, punishments against suicide. These punishments against suicide eventually push people to commit suicide. Let's look at it. If I'm standing on the Manhattan Bridge, standing off the railing, I will feel, when I see the police car driving up to me, I know that the minute that policeman comes, if I cross over the bridge, I will be arrested and put into jail. That is what drives people to commit suicide. The fact is that I know the action that I was standing there on the bridge is something they can punish me for, and I'm not going to think twice about it anymore because I know the minute I get off that bridge, I will be put into a cell. That is what happens. Thirdly, even if you wanted to put an individual into rehab, it doesn't work. An individual has to want it for themselves. It has to be something that comes from the heart. By forcing people, all you are doing is you are making them lose their will to change things. Because let's look at it. If you didn't really want to do it, it will fail and it will never work out because you're just going to minimize and diminish an individual's ability to do so. Fourthly, the law and courts are uncompassionate. Being pulled into a courtroom, being shown and in front of a huge tribunal, the fact is, it is something that does not convince an individual. It is something that only adds further harm to the individual. The government's duty is to inform its people, not further than that. Madam Speaker, I have never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Minister, and I invite your opposition.
What do you think?
If in life, you can just do whatever is it that you want, just because it's your own body, then I assure you, life is going to be so much fun. But however, that's not the case. We need to understand that under each actions, there will be consequences that will be obtained by other people, which is simply what that's prohibiting me from using my water bottle as a wine bottle. Now, it was a great speech coming from Prime Minister, and I'm pretty sure we all know how much Imran likes the example of mountain climbing, but we also need to understand that there is few problems with his speech, which is what I'm going to do as leader of opposition in today's debate. I'm going to do three things. I'm going to first give 3 points of rebuttals, and second of all, I'm going to show you what is the burdens for both sides of both sides in today's debate, and I'm going to give you one argument on how the actions of self-harm does include third-party harms, and how that is something that we should never stand by for. One by one. First off, the rebuttals. 3 points of rebuttals. First of all, you should never assume that your actions will only harm yourself, because there will continuously be third-party harms, either physically or emotionally, which I'll continue to expound in my argument. The second of all, that when they give the example of female mutilation, we see that female mutilation is inherently wrong in status quo right now. So we see that the government is actually trying to send a bad message by condoning these actions under the guise of actually allowing it to be allowing it to be condoned by these people under the guise of it being self-harm and under your own particular volition. Not now, Devesh. Third of all, the idea and the explanation that Imran gave about suicide, and they said how that this will actually be punished once you actually attempted suicide. We want to tell you that rehab is not actually a punishment. Rehab is there for a reason, and that is to actually rehabilitate you and try to put you back in a more appropriate and a reasonable path. But before I go on to clarify the burdens, Imran, Aaron.
So, individuals who want to go to rehab, if that's the case, why don't they rehab instead of from the basic way to jump over?
No, we're going to tell you this, that once you actually attempted suicide and you actually claim that rehabilitation is actually being a punishment, then that is a wrong idea. Because rehab is there for the government is actually trying to send you to a better path. Because we need to understand that suicide is not only, it's not positive just because you claim that you have the particular right to do whatever is it that you want with your own body. We need to understand that there are consequences to other people, especially emotional consequences, which I'll continue to expound under in my arguments. So now, the clarifications of burdens in today's debate. Our opposition have two particular burdens. We're going to show you that there's no need to remove these laws that's already existing in status quo right now, and I'm going to show you that by removing these laws that prohibit self-harm, you're actually adding unique harms to the existing status quo, and we're going to show you how that it makes the status quo worse. And government have two burdens in today's debate. They need to prove to us that individuals have complete autonomy over their body, and second of all, they need to show that their actions done under the guise of self-harm will only inflict harm upon themselves and not other people, be it physical harms or emotional harms. Our stance is simple and clear. We want to defend the status quo and show you that status quo is already fine right now, and there's no need to remove these particular laws. So now, my first argument under the key phrase of how actions of self-harm does include third-party harms. Two levels of analysis. First level, I'll characterize to you the concept of the principle of bodily autonomy, and second of all, I'll show you how these actions will actually lead to third-party harms in two ways: physical harms and emotional harms. Let's go one by one. Onto the first level of analysis, on the principle of bodily autonomy. As exactly perfectly delineated by Imran, bodily autonomy or self-harm is when you have the right and you think that you want to do something with your particular body, you can actually do so, i.e. suicide or smoking or even drug consumption. But like all theories of rights, like all concepts and principles, this concept has a line and has a boundary too. We see that bodily autonomy or even choice or legitimacy of choice doesn't apply when you actually inflict harm upon others. So when we see that your action of self-harm actually influences or inflict harm upon other people, we don't actually think that your principle actually applies, nor does it act as a principal justification for you to continue to condone these particular actions in your life, because it will harm people either indirectly or directly. But before I go on to my second level, sure, Dinesh.
Your contention is that I have an emotional responsibility to other people. If I am a woman in a Christian family, does that mean I cannot walk my baby because it causes emotional harm to my community and my family?
No, we need to understand that first of all, you need to think that whether or not your actions will actually continue to have effects on people. If we see that your form of actions will only be rejected by society because society is going to view you in a narrowed and screwed down perspective, then we think that it should not be condoned. Because you need to first clarify what form of harms are you actually inflicting, either physical harms or emotional harms. And when we see that it exclusively brings these form of harms, we think that your idea or your only sole justification of it being your particular body does not actually apply under any circumstances. Second level, on how these actions of self-harm actually leads to third-party harms. Two ways: physical harms. We have the examples of second-hand smoking. Unlike Imran, I'm not going to show you mountain climbing. We see that smoking in public areas because you think that you want to just smoke because you think that you don't care what happens to your own particular body. Well, we see that when you smoke in public areas, which is prohibited by the law in status quo right now, we think that it leads to second-hand smoking, which actually affects other people. You have drug consumption that can lead to people being too high and overconsumption of these drugs, which lead to third-party harms because people will start losing their irrationality and not doing actions bound their rationality, which means that they will start doing actions not by thinking wisely, which means that they will continue to doing stuff like even killing people or starting robbing people because they no longer have that rationale to actually fight or to actually think whether their actions have a moral, rational calculus behind it. Second of all, on emotional harms, because you need to understand that your actions not only affect yourself, it affects the society, families, and friends that you are particularly connected to. What form of emotional harms am I talking about? Three harms. First off, it gives no proper closure for the family. First off, when you say that suicide, just because you think that you have one particular problem and you think that suicide is the perfect ending to your perfect lifestyle, you need to understand that there's a family waiting for you. There are friends, there are relatives who actually hold you dear to their life. Just suicide because you think that it's going to be happy for your particular life, you need to understand you're adding grief to this particular family. And second of all, to add people's grief, because it adds people's sadness. It's because you care about yourself and not other people. And third of all, on anorexic and bulimic lifestyle, because no parents would actually stand by bulimic or anorexic lifestyle, especially if their children are the one who are condoning it. So we see that your action of self-harms would definitely inflict third-party harms, and that's why your sole justification of bodily autonomy does not apply under any circumstances, which is why I'm proud to oppose.
What we just heard out of the leader of opposition, while admirable in its intentions, was a very, very narrow and immature conception of what it means to be human and who you owe responsibility to in a society. I'm going to evolve this debate by looking first at three questions in rebuttal. What did they accuse us of in terms of what we condone? Secondly, who do you owe a duty to as a person, whether it be emotional or otherwise? And finally, I'm going to take down their point in bodily autonomy and tell you why it is supremely harmful to use emotional harm as your gauge in the law for determining how much harm you do to other people. I'm then going to forward our case by talking to you about a paternalistic state and why this isn't the society that we want to achieve in the long run. Let's look at what they said. They first accused us of condoning bad actions. This was never the case. As a state, we were very clear in our Prime Minister to set up that our duty is to inform. We can tell you what the actions are. Indeed, these are the tenets of an informed choice. If an individual knows these consequences, and if he doesn't, we can try to inform him better. And if under those circumstances, he decides that smoking marijuana makes me happy, it leads me to a brief escapism from this life, then I have every right to use that marijuana to do as I see fit. A state doesn't impose its will upon other people. So we don't condone FGM, we would never do that, but in the circumstance that your religion or whatever your interpretation of it makes you happy, then in that case, if you want to do it, fine. Incessantly, this is the reason why religion sometimes has many interpretations and why paternalistic religions often fail. For example, in the case of Islam, you can be a Muslim and choose not to wear the hijab in the prescribed way. That doesn't make you any less of a Muslim than anyone else. What they would suggest is that Islam needs to impose its will upon other people based on what they feel to be the right interpretation of Islam. This is the true conception of happiness. We can inform, but we cannot impose. That is the view that we set for ourselves. Secondly, on third-party harms and emotional bodily autonomy. Their conception of bodily autonomy was a very, very sneaky point because they actually didn't redefine anything at all. Their conception of bodily autonomy is exactly the same as ours. The only thing different was that they tried to define emotional harms. Let's take down physical harms first. Clearly, this is a ridiculous point. We never said that we're going to allow you to run around rampaging, killing people under drugs, all that kind of stuff. That's a very slippery slope. Watch out for that time to climb back upside opposition. Because clearly, if your actions bring harm to other people, then we're going to stop you. No, thank you, sir. Incidentally, this is a very good way to ensure a responsible society, which is why in states where marijuana is legal, they don't commit those actions because they have an incentive to make sure that the government doesn't stop them using drugs, because the only way they get to continue using drugs is if they use it responsibly. That's why by devolving power to people and enabling them to make responsible choices, they have an incentive to make sure that those privileges are not taken away from them. That is why we get the best form of responsible self-harm that doesn't trickle down to tangible effects on other people. Finally, let's take down their emotional harm, because I think this is a very, very dangerous area of the law to dabble in. The reason why the law is designed to protect is that it operates based on fact. If you start dabbling in realms of law where emotional harm is used as evidence and is used as a means for dictating what other people can and cannot do, it becomes immensely difficult for anyone to do anything at all. Let me extend their principle to show you what it really means. You as a person now no longer have a responsibility first to yourself and to ensure that you don't infringe the rights of other people. You now have a responsibility to make other people happy. This is literally the extension of what they are saying, that you have a responsibility to make sure that your actions don't cause grief to other people. Do we regret that the families of people who commit suicide are sad? Yes. Do we regret that parents of people who use drugs might not like it? Yes. But do we have a right to judge based on that? Absolutely not. You exist as an individual in this world on your own accord. This might sound selfish, but it is true. You owe a responsibility to no one but yourself. If you choose to owe responsibility to other people, for example, you make a decision to have a child, then that might be different. But in the case where you live on your own accord, you live beholden to yourself and obey the laws of the state, you owe no responsibility to make other people happy, and judging on those criteria is dangerous, because if you think about it, you are one person, society is everyone else. So by definition, the emotions of society are always going to outweigh your emotion, and you can always find someone out there who is upset by your actions. Using this as a metric in law is a terrible, terrible idea, because you are never going to be able to prove in court that your own insignificant emotions outweigh those of the rest of society. Which is why I think their response in a moment after I finish this, which is why I think their response to my POI about abortion was faulty. Because if indeed we accept his characterization that emotional harm is important, then they would take away the ability of women living in Christian communities to commit abortion if they so choose. This is a sacred right given to women, the right to have autonomy over their own body. But in their case, in their world, if it caused grief to their family, they will no longer allow it. I think this is shameful and I can't stand for it. Go ahead.
If you're saying that the emotions of other people are really that unimportant, please explain to me why it's one of the three principles of law is to give closure to the families of the victims.
Yeah, it's one of the three principles of law, but it doesn't come at the expense of other things. Like the law is also designed to protect you. What did you clearly haven't been listening. I just told you why it's faulty to use that as an arbitration standard, given that you can't judge it accurately. The law intends to give emotional closure after it can prove based on solid fact that you committed a crime. The law doesn't go out there using an emotional meter to assess the sadness level of everyone in the community, then give closure to the same people, it just assess the emotions off. That's a ridiculous standard for any legal principle to apply. I'm going to talk about a paternalistic state now and explain to you why this is a terrible idea. Take a moment, and I'm absolutely serious here. Look out of the window. Look at the cars going by and people living their lives. It's insignificant. In the grand scheme of things, there is zero inherent value to life. Your life means nothing. One day it will all cease to exist, people will forget you. But people still continue to live their lives, continue to do what makes them happy. And the reason for this is that it's important to them in this life. People believe in religion even though there's no proof of it, because it makes them happy and gives them salvation. In exactly the same way, a person's ability to find happiness in this life should not be dictated by a paternalistic state. Sure, a state could say, it's my job to make you live the best life possible. I'll ban you from eating fast food, ban you from doing anything unhealthy, try to make your life the objectively good life. That might very well be feasibly possible. But states don't do that because different people have different conceptions of what it means to be human and what it means to be happy. In that circumstance, our job as a state is not to be paternalistic and take away those choice-making powers from you, but rather to ensure that the maximum number of people have the ability to make choices and the ability to conceptualize their idea of what it means to be happy. In those circumstances, Their side is trying to say that insofar as we can find one person that is sad, find some reason why you shouldn't do this, we'll strip you of your rights. We don't think that's fair. We think that insofar as your ability to make choices doesn't hinder other people, then even if someone else thinks, or even if a state thinks those actions are wrong, if it makes you happy, I say go ahead. We are very proud to propose.
I think you have to find this right on,
It is a fact that most of us here really do want to live in a world like Devesh says, that we have no obligations to anyone else except to ourselves. But the only thing prevent my speech today from becoming an all-out rant against religion instead of law is because I have responsibilities to these two guys here. I don't really care about my speaker's course at the end of the day, but because I cannot let my teammates down, that is the point where I actually need to focus on my obligations, right? Humans don't actually live on their own. We actually need and do have obligations and responsibilities to others. Yes, we should not sacrifice we should not sacrifice ourselves for others' happiness. Yes, we should not always prioritize others over ourselves. But there is the point in time when we actually do cause harm to others, and that is actually a point of consideration in our everyday actions, right? So, side government's case today is really simple. They say, live your life however you want, but don't cause harm to others, right? Two levels of rebuttals. First of all, no thank you. First of all, how you, although you don't cause harm to others, you actually still have a responsibility to others. In fact, you have a responsibility to your family. If you're an employee, you have a responsibility to your company. If you're a student, you have a responsibility to your school. And if you're a citizen of a country, you have a responsibility to a nation. Yes, you should not sacrifice your entire life for that sake, but you should take into consideration the benefits and these people's, what do these people actually think about your actions? No, thank you. And secondly, even if you don't want to think about these actions, it's actually okay. But are your actions really only affecting yourself? They say that marijuana will only affect yourself. What about the loss of productivity at work? What about you actually affecting your spouse who doesn't really like marijuana, and at the end of the day, affecting his or her entire lifestyle? No, thank you. And what if you actually take on hard drugs, which is not banned under their paradigm, and actually get overdosed, either die, or if you don't die, get high and rob others? When this third-party harm actually happens, how is their paradigm actually going to handle this? No, thank you. So their point of view, which is the emotional burden of a person, doesn't really matter. I say it does matter, especially when we say one of the three basic principles of law, although it's the third, is to provide closure for the victim's family. Sure, we shouldn't sacrifice all the other values of law just for the sake of emotional fulfillment, but we are not doing so. We are protecting the welfare of citizens. We are protecting the other rights of other people except the individual who wants to inflict self-harm, at the same time protecting their emotional interests. So unlike Devesh, we are not sacrificing emotion for others. We are doing a win-win situation, right? So before I go into my substantives, sure.
The difference is that you choose those things based on what we need to be happy. The reason why we treat other people well is because our relationships with them mean something to us. Don't you think a person who uses drugs who is a student would have a natural incentive not to get kicked out of school? I don't see why people can't decide that for themselves.
So, if you really think that a person doing drugs is inherently bad, please explain to me why does the state does not have an imperative to actually arbitrarily go through with this moral compass? When they say that when these people could actually use their own moral compass, then we don't need law, right? Because people have their own rational mind. We say that law and order is there because they are people who don't use their rational mind. And it's the state's responsibility to make sure that these irrational people don't actually affect the lives of other rational people that are in the society. No, thank you. So going to my two substances today, right? First of all, I'm going to tell you how your body is actually not yours. Because when we say at the end of the day,
if you actually kill yourself or you actually get into a low productivity state due to excessive use of marijuana, first of all, your country will lose human capital, effective human capital, in a sense of economic development, right? Because when you actually high on marijuana all day, your productivity won't actually be as high as others, right? When we see that your country needs more people, needs more effective workforce, you in your own pleasurable night of being high in the cloud nine doesn't really help that, right? So even if we say that your country doesn't need you, we say that the state has an inherent responsibility to take care of the welfare of the citizens, no matter whether the citizens want it or not. No prisoner wants jail, but just because no prisoner wants jail, should we not jail anyone? Just because no one who wants to commit suicide wants to rehab, doesn't mean that we should not do rehab, because we know that rehab is inherently good for these people who actually have suicidal thoughts. When we know something is inherently good for someone, it is the state's job to actually push through with this, to actually do their inherent responsibility to take care of the citizens' welfare, right? Okay, we concede that someone's mental health cannot be fully protected when we actually force them to go through rehab. Like someone suicidal would actually enjoy the rehabilitation process, but that's not the point, is it? We are here not to take care of these individuals' mental health. We will make sure that these individuals' mental health, which they deem correct, is actually not by our standards, right? Just because they think that their way of life is okay, we say that no. Just because people extremists think that their way of life is to curse all other religions, we don't see that as right, because we know that it is inherently wrong. And when the state, we believe that the state has certain authority to push through with its own moral compass, because it has a responsibility to take care of the welfare of the citizens. And that means putting majority opinion and putting the welfare of the majority ahead of the minority, right? And when that actually comes into play, they need to justify why are they prioritizing the needs of the minority, the thinking of the minority ahead of the majority, when we have proven to you that this thinking may cause third-party harm to others, right? Secondly, the message of government, right? When Tavish came out and said that we know that drugs are inherently bad, we know that female genital mutilation is inherently bad, we say that if you know it is inherently bad, there is no reason for you to condone it, even though that individual wants it, right? Even though an individual wants to take hard drugs, if we know it's inherently bad, we ban it because we know it is for the welfare of the citizens. Even if it does not bring any welfare for the citizens, we think that is a symbolic gesture that we make, that it is bad for you to actually do female genital mutilation. It is actually bad for you to smoke or take drugs, right? And when we say that you don't actually do your job as the arbiter of societal and universal values, people will say that anorexia nervosa is an acceptable way to get thin. People will say that bulimia is an acceptable way to get thin because it only harms myself. We say that these universally unacceptable actions should not be allowed by the government, and since it is our government, it is as the government's burden to actually care for the citizens, as a caring and responsible government, we will not stand by acts of self-harm.
I think there's definitely our opposition, and I'm like the
The beauty of society is that we aren't reduced to meaningless units of productivity that work to infinity for the use of some vague other being that exists out there. No, we work for ourselves. Society is created for individuals. It doesn't go the other way around. There are two questions we have to ask in this debate. Number one, do governments have a right to punish self-harm? Is there an intrinsic need for governments to do this? And the second question, which is a less important one in this debate, is if we are so obsessed with discouraging self-harm, is the law really the best way to go about with it? So first question, do governments have a right to punish self-harm? And one thing both teams agreed on is that we can punish self-harm if there's a clear third-party harm. So this breaks down to a minor question. Does self-harm cause third-party harm? Well, implied within the meaning of self-harm is that it only harms yourself, but let's put petty semantics aside. Well, firstly, on the first level, in the case of a clear physical harm to someone else, we would punish you. We're okay with that. If we ban smoking in public because it does harm other individuals, but we don't ban smoking in principle. But if you get high and mug someone, we punish you not because you got high, but because you mugged someone. In other words, the action in and of itself is not punishable. It's only punishable when it affects other people, and we're fine with that. But let's go on to the second level. How about emotional third-party harm? This is where we really don't think it is a third-party harm to begin with, and therefore you can't punish it. Because every action you take as an individual has far-reaching effects to everyone else in society. Every single thing you do will affect someone. No, thank you. And it's very hard to draw the line to what extent is that emotional harm worthwhile. The implication of this line of reasoning is that individual actions can never exist because you're forever serving the needs of other people and their emotions. Your choice to compete in a debate competition is going to harm someone else's feeling because you might win and deny them the opportunity to win. Does that mean that you should never be able to get the choice to participate to begin with? Your choice to get married to the lover of your dreams might make your parents angry. Does that mean that you never get the chance to marry at all to begin with? Given that emotional harm is so far-reaching and so vague and subjective, we can never use it as a line of reasoning to punish anything. Because if that is the case, the implication is that individual choice can never exist. We are just slaves and shackled to society. But there are also two problems with emotions. The first problem with emotions is that they're very subjective. The extent can never be ascertained. This is particularly problematic when it comes to the law, because the law works with certainty. The law works with tangibility. If we can never ascertain the extent of your emotions, we can never punish you based on it. Now, the emotions can be used to decide the extent of punishment if we can agree that there is a tangible effect to what you've done, but they're never a reason to punish you to begin with. This is why if you murder someone, that is the physical reasoning behind why you get punished, and the emotions might play a factor in determining the extent of your actions, but the emotions never decide whether you're guilty to begin with, and that's the reason why the law works that way. The second problem with emotions is that emotions change. Part of the human experience is learning to move on from bitter emotions. This is why emotions can change. You can move on from it. It can make something good of it. But you are forever, on their side, they forever shackle an individual to the expectations of society. So on our side, you can mold emotions to your advantage. But on their side, the individual is forever constrained to society. So we think that in this case, emotions should never be a benchmark to whether we decide whether action is right or wrong. On the third level, how about the idea of responsibility to other people? Do we have a responsibility to society at large? Now, the thing is here, fulfillment of these responsibilities to society gives you privileges in life. If you're responsible to your company, you get promoted, you get a job, you get to keep the job as well. They can fire you if they want, if you're not responsible. If you're responsible to your family, you get a meaningful relationship to your family. But the key point here is this, that society incentivizes you to be responsible to those around you by giving you these privileges in life, meaningful relationships, and meaningful job. But it can never force you to engage in those responsibilities by fiat. In other words, when you fulfill these responsibilities, it gives you things, but if you don't fulfill them, it shouldn't take away your things. You can't force the responsibility upon an individual. But how about this fourth level? The idea that your country needs you, that governments must protect the welfare of citizens, you must be a productive member of society, you can't take drugs, those kind of things. Well, the problem with that line of argumentation coming from the second speaker is that it reduces the individual to a meaningless unit in society. But the problem here is this, we work to make society productive for your gain. We work to create a society where you can carry out your conception of the good life. No, thank you. But in the event that we are creating that society, we trample upon your conception of the good life, we trample upon your personal choice and the ability to work as an individual in society, then there is no meaning to what we're doing. Because even if you create that society, you don't get to enjoy the benefits of that society. So we don't think this idea of reducing an individual to a meaningless unit of society has any bearing because it defeats the point of making society productive and efficient to begin with. But very gone, any one of you.
So if we're right by saying that your side actually agrees that self-harm, for instance, FGM, is inherently bad for the individual, but just condone it because they want to.
Well, okay, if you're a 20-year-old woman and you decide that FGM is the best way to get religious fulfillment in your life and you're perfectly fine, you know the health risks of it, go ahead, we're not stopping you. If you're a 12-year-old girl and it's been forced upon you, we have a problem with that. That is our stance. I think it's very agreeable to have the stance. So this comes to the second question. We've established that there's no principal reason to punish an individual when they harm themselves. But do we want to discourage self-harm? Well, they're obsessed with discouraging self-harm. So let's talk about it. Does the law really work? Because in certain cases, we like to give individuals the opportunities, but we recognize that self-harm isn't something nice. We wouldn't use the law to punish you, but we want to discourage it as far as possible. Well, here's the first problem with using the law. It's because if you punish a person for self-harming, they have no incentive to seek help. There's no incentive to discuss suicidal thoughts. There's no incentive
to discuss your drug use with anyone else, because it puts you in a situation where if at any time society finds out that you're a drug addict, they can force you into prison in certain cases, and in nicer cases, they can force you into rehab. But this comes to the second problem. Individuals don't really want to go to rehab. In certain cases, individuals want to solve the problem by themselves, or individuals just don't see a purpose in rehab. Forcing an individual to rehab, using the law to force them into rehab, just doesn't work. Let's understand that changing depression, changing suicidal thoughts, stopping your lifestyle as a drug addict is not an easy decision. You don't just go to rehab for 3 months and you exit rehab a changed person. It takes a strong amount of willpower, it takes a strong amount of your own volition to break out of that cycle. In many cases, individuals get forced into rehab, they come out, they relapse, and it doesn't work. And each and every time an individual goes to rehab and they fail, it destroys their willpower to go on. It keeps them even more forever shackled to this idea that I can never change my life, and therefore that's what happens when people get depressed. On our side, we recognize that rehab only works if you want it. We will give you every single means necessary to change your life and to make you a better person, but we can never force that upon you because it just doesn't work.
At the end of today's debate, we are all going to live in either two worlds. Either the world of the government, how the government perceives it, or how the opposition perceives it. Now, the government's world may sound better. In a way, it sounds like Wonderland, or in how the opposition sees it, it sounds like my moral essay. Everything goes well and everything goes good. But for this debate to be broken down into a way where we need to see in a better perspective, we have to look at it from a simpler form and from a point of a person on the street. Let's look at the heart of it, okay? But before I tackle the main issue and show you why the opposition deserves to take today's debate, let me harp on the few things that caused side government's case to run down the drain. Now, the main problem, okay, that we find here is that the law works as a way to help to curb this problem. Now, the first thing that we thought that we didn't see is that why didn't the government take into account trying to fix the law, because the law is there to help us rather than trying to abolish it. Now, I'm going to go into the few arguments that we believe should be looked at here. Now, the first part is where they talked about how should people deserve to do what they will. From the opposition side, we say no, because as the government, we want to take the initiative because people do not know better. But in their world, they think that people have a perfect rationale and they will know exactly what to do and how not to influence other people on the things they do. But when we look at reality, that's not how it is. Yes, sir.
If you believe that your work society is judged by your functionality and productivity, and that for the second statement you have a duty to your country, would you criminalize voluntary unemployment?
I'm sorry, can you please repeat the last part?
Would you criminalize people who chose not to work?
We would not criminalize people who not choose to work. I'm sorry, I don't understand how is that in. Sorry. Okay, I'm so sorry. Okay. Now moving on. Okay. Now, before I tackle the main issue, one more part that will contribute to what I say later is how the perfect thing that the government thinks is that when they said earlier that when in the circumstance where the third party is harmed, the government will step in. Now, this is where I want you to look at a perspective from a normal person. Okay, just imagine. Okay, for example, your father is a drunk. Okay, and out of drinking too much, he does harm his child. Okay, now you see the government cannot go into such individual cases like this. It's because it's almost impossible. Okay, but when it is bound by law, okay, we see that it's a better medium for us to find out about this, because this is where law is needed. No, thank you. Okay. Now, now the main question that has to be answered in today's debate, or the main issue here, is that should an individual's wants be put on top of society's needs? Now, I'm going to break this down into two main issues that we must look at here. The first being is, will there be a third-party harm in the first place? Now, claimed by the Prime Minister, he claims that, oh no, most of the times third-party harm won't happen. And this is again a perfect world thing that the government thinks. But in reality, we do not see so. The second thing is that where they say that when a person carries out certain things, for example, suicide, that harms themselves, it may not harm the other self. Now, as I explain this, I would ask you to please not look at this as from a point of a debater, but please look at this from a point as an individual or a normal person. Do you really think your life has no effect on anyone else? Do you really think that whatever you do or when you harm yourself, it does not harm anyone else? And then they brought it up about emotions. True that there can be a fair argument, but we have to understand this, okay? Emotions can affect actions. Yeah, that is why we see people committing certain suicides, and these suicides affect other people's emotions, and that emotion will cause them to create more actions. So this chain reaction proves at itself that certain actions can influence other people to do other actions that are not supposed to be done. This proves that in reality, people's lives do have a great influence on others, or in other words, society. Yes, sir.
How do you, as a court of law, ascertain emotional impact?
Sir, we say that emotional impact is to be taken into account when when for example, okay, when people carry out certain suicide, something it affects through, these people may get emotional. Well, if you go through depression or through stuff like that, well, it is hard to judge. But when these emotions lead to you causing more harm to yourself, no thank you, sir, we see that it is a problem, and that is a problem that we need to tackle. Okay. Now, let's look for the fact at the people who commit suicide here. Okay, let me speak on this for a while. Okay, now you see, there are two types of people who generally commit suicide. Some people do it at home. Why? Because they believe that it is a rash. They believe that they should die now and they shouldn't die in that way. And I will tackle this point after that. But before that, there's also no thank you. But before that, there's also people who tend to commit suicide in public. Now let's just look at this for a second, okay? Why do people sometimes commit these suicides in public? It's because they want attention. And then you said that you do not want this police, if we had this law, police will come running down their throats, and this is not what we want. But in the first place, these people are asking for attention. And why do we as the government think that this is important? Is because it can actually cause potential harms, as proven by the opposition side over and over again. Realistically, if it will cause harms, realistically, it does have an influence. Okay, now, okay, yeah, that's about it. So from opposition side, what we want you to do to look in today's debate is from this standard. Okay. Do we have an influence in other people's lives? And when we do possible things that harm ourselves, does that have an influence to harm others? Think rationally, yes, it does, because it is impossible to create a situation where your harms does not affect society, where your harms only affect yourself and have no influence of another. Think for this, if you were a mother, if you were a child, if you were anyone for that matter of fact, okay? Let's think realistically and believe that we need these laws to be able to, we need these laws that prohibit self-harm to create a better and more realistic world, because we are tackling the problem from a realistic point and not from a wonderland point. Thank you.
Right, I think the opposition, and I invited the opposition.
Interesting question coming from side government today. Are men slaves of society? Well, if we were truly free from all societal norms, well, we wouldn't be wearing this in today's round of debate. We wouldn't like shooting off swear words here and there, right? So humans, in a certain degree of a certain extent, do need to conform to societal needs and societal norms. But don't need to be too pessimistic, right? Because today's debate asks us two questions. First of all, should we place our own interests over societal needs? Should we live out the life the way we want instead of what the society requires of us? To be honest, this is a false dichotomy coming from side government, right? Because we don't see any conflict in living out the life we want and fulfilling the societal needs at the same time. We say that from side opposition, it is a win-win situation when you actually skipping in the general context of societal norms can contribute to the society and can contribute to a meaningful life. We don't say that a person living in according to side government's logic, a person living in societal norm for their whole life, marrying a woman, giving birth to a child, working until they're 60, having pension until they die, they say that this life is boring. But for that individual, that life could be the most fulfilling life that he could ever wish. We say that fulfillment of life is purely subjective, and it's not up to side government to say that the only way you can live your life to the fullest is by committing acts of self-harm. But nevertheless, let's take a look at their examples of people who inherently want to commit self-harm. I asked them whether they think that self-harm is inherently bad. They didn't answer the question. But from the three speeches, we could say that they do think certain acts of self-harm, like consuming hard drugs or FGM, is inherently bad. But they're just respecting the wishes of the people, right? We say that there is a line to be drawn between wishes to be respected and arbitrary societal values to be enforced. Why are we not okay with jihadists? Why are we not okay with hate speech? It's not because they bomb people up. This is because they themselves are living the wrong way of life. We say that they are misinterpreting the way of religion. We say that these people are wrong. And they are wrong not because of the actions they do to others. They are inherently wrong because of the beliefs they carry. And this is because the government, as per any layman, has a certain moral compass to enforce. The state has certain values and certain societal norms to actually enforce in that certain state, right? And when we say that the government has every right to enforce this in all ways of life, why doesn't the government have the right to enforce this in acts of self-harm, such as FGM, such as suicide, such as drug consumption, so on and so forth? Next, what are the effects of acts of self-harm, right? Because they didn't want to talk to us about third-party harms because they say that the name itself implies it only causes harm to themselves. But as Aaron said, people who are high generally tend to harm others, and people get caught when they harm others. Yes, but when we identify that people tend to harm others when they are high, why couldn't we stop people from getting high in the first place? Because it really doesn't bring much benefit except from him being high, right? And when we say that him being high is a temporary form of escapism, and we say that escapism isn't really going to help him in the long run, we as a state believe that we have a power to actually enforce this societal norm on him and actually have him live the correct way of life, right? He may say that we are selfish, that we think that we can enforce these ways of life, but in actual fact, we are doing so in everyday life. We are enforcing dress codes, we are enforcing laws and orders that we think are right. So why can't we enforce these laws and orders on this particular individual, which they already concede is inherently bad? And when emotions come into play, yes, in general, emotions couldn't be used as a yardstick. But when parents will feel sad about the loss of their child, we say that these are universal emotions that apply in an absolute majority of situations. And when this actually comes to play, we feel it's totally justified for the state to do what is right.
And the answer to this entire debate was given to us by his reply speech, when he asked us, why can't you respect a man who works till he's 60, gets a pension, has a family? We can respect it. That is a lifestyle he chooses, and he's happy with that. We would ask that they respect the same people who choose other lifestyles. In the same way that we respect that, and they agree that an alternative lifestyle should be respected, anyone who chooses a lifestyle for themselves should be allowed to do so. Let's walk through the world of side opposition and take them down one by one. Firstly, let's concede that they had a very, very narrow conception of what it meant to harm yourself in this debate. Let's list it out. Side government in this debate was asked to defend first people smoking in public, even though we said that we won't allow people to smoke in public. Then we were asked to defend drunken fathers who drink alcohol and abuse their kids, even though clearly we wouldn't stand for that. Then finally in the reply speech, we were asked to justify jihadism and bombing people and hate speech. All of these things harm other people. We are not going to stand for that. But insofar as you can decide for yourself what you want to do without harming other people, that's fine. Incidentally, giving people the responsible choice to harm themselves is the only way you get a society where people do things that harm themselves responsibly. Like, man, you wanted to talk about the real world? Look at the evidence of criminalizing drug usage. It hasn't worked. Your rehabilitation is pushing people back to relapses. Your idea of regulation is causing society to break down. In places where states are more free and where they open the grounds for liberalization and responsible use, those are the places where you get truly free and responsible choices. So if you want to live in a real world, examine your real world. It's not working. Yeah. Let's ask a question. Do you think that you live in a vacuum and that your actions don't affect other people? No, we don't. We agree. You live in a web and everything you do affects other people. We just thought that it shouldn't be a metric for what the law does or does not punish. And that was the point in this debate. Do we agree that you have emotional impact upon other people? Of course. We never said you didn't. What we said was that is a very dangerous way, an arbitrary way for a law to adjudicate what can and cannot be punished. More importantly, it's almost impossible, given that in every possible circumstance, your actions have different emotional impacts in different circumstances, and given that we'd like our law to be as objective, fair, and grounded in certainty as possible, we think our standard is a better one. He raised a POI about the closure for the victims. The problem is there is no victim here. You're inflicting harm upon yourself of your own volition. There is no victim to this crime because firstly, you don't think it should be a crime, and you're not really a victim if you're doing it to yourself. Can we give closure to the parents? Sure. We'll offer counseling for the parents who have lost kids. We'll try our best to create a society where people don't make these choices. But that's the point, right? If people have the information and still decide that's their conception of a happy life, then go ahead. It's a very humbling realization when you consider yourself from the perspective of a state and realize that no matter how much you think something is good, and no matter how much you can logically justify it to someone else, you'll never be able to convince people what makes them happy. And it's very humbling to realize that you don't have control over that. So realize that you don't have control over that and try to do what you can to enable the choices that make people happy, decided by the only people who can decide it themselves. Do I have a right to harm myself? And this is the main issue in the debate. Two things. One, the idea of emotions. Two, bodily autonomy. We think bodily autonomy is one thing. The fact that it's self-harm implies that all their analysis, which was grounded in literally only harming other people, shouldn't stand in this debate. But more importantly, let's boil it down to one single principle. At the end of this debate, if I choose to do something that makes me happy, you might think it's a stupid choice. Everyone in this room might think it's a stupid choice. It doesn't matter. People make choices for reasons that are incomprehensible to all of us. And in the grand scheme of things, that is the only thing that matters. That a state gives freedom to the maximum number of people, and at the point at which people choose something for themselves, those choices need to be protected. We are very proud to propose.
Yeah.